Thanks for having me.
Wicked. So I talked to you a little bit before earlier on about like the kind of way that we're going to do this pod therapy type situation. Um, so we got a lot of questions from a lot of people, and I was really excited by the kind of response that we got. What we're going to do though is we're going to start off with questions that are asking more about you. A lot of people are
Sure
really
thing.
interested about you and what it is that you're doing. Especially there's one guy called Joel who I'd love to get on a podcast with you, like a three-way kind of podcast. He's really insightful, and I think he'd have some really cool questions for you as well. Um, but for now, let's start off with these. I'll go straight with the first question if you're ready.
Go for it.
Cool. What type of therapy do you specialize in, and what does that particular type of therapy target?
Okay, so I guess just a little bit of background. So I'm a registered mental health nurse, and I work part-time in the NHS, but I'm also a yoga teacher, and I've done that for donkey's years. And through my yoga training, I came to therapy. So it's kind of like, for me, like joining up the circle a little bit. It's all about people. That's kind of kind of what I'm interested in.
Mm,
And the kind of therapy I do is something called EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. It's kind of a long word, or a long name. And it's essentially trauma therapy. So it's a specialist kind of therapy for people who suffer trauma. We can think of trauma in a few ways. So obvious forms of trauma are, for example, if you've been to war and you've witnessed a lot of bad stuff, and you've come back and you're having some symptoms, really, so such as nightmares whilst you're sleeping, maybe flashbacks, for example. Maybe your brain's really foggy, you're unable to concentrate. Maybe you're getting really kind of pushing everybody away from you, and kind of your relationships aren't good, for example. So that's kind of one of the more obvious forms of therapy, trauma, that I would work with. Other forms of trauma might be like if you were in a natural disaster, for example, and you almost faced death. Um, some other traumas might be if you were in a car accident and couldn't get back onto the motorway or get back into driving. And that's kind of obvious, really, that there's something happened and afterwards you were changed and there was some difference in your life, or what we might call a behavioral change in your life. Um, Other forms of trauma are maybe less obvious to the outside eye, and those can be like developmental trauma. So some people may have grown up in situations which were less than ideal. Maybe the parenting wasn't so good, or maybe for other reasons the parents split or something. Maybe there was some bad treatment, for example. So that can also cause trauma, but sometimes that trauma is over time. It happens a lot over a
mm,
long period of time. And that's another form of trauma that I work with. So essentially, to answer the question, is I'm an EMDR therapist, and eye movement desensitization and reprocessing therapist, and I work with people who have trauma.
yeah. Well, and it covers a clearly a very broad like spectrum.
Pretty broad. And it's interesting, actually, because in kind of the mental health field in general, there's a lot of thought now that a lot of conditions, which might be termed mental health conditions, are actually, could have the basis in traumatic experiences in our life, no matter how big or small that trauma is. One of the traumas, which is kind of like really kind of insipid and kind of goes right under the radar, is essentially bullying. And
Right.
bullying
Yeah.
happens to a high volume of people when they're young. And it's somehow like, I don't know, some people think it's like a rite of passage or something, or it's like, oh, it just happens to everyone or something like that. And they write it
Mm,
off that way. But this kind of bullying, it can be kind of low level bullying or kind of like much more overt bullying. But this kind of bullying leads to humiliation. You're
yeah.
humiliated in the act of being bullied. And also you start to take on what you're being told, that you're bad for something, which could be essentially who you are,
Mm,
a central part of your being. And that could be around race, of course. A lot of bullying around that. There's a lot
yeah.
of oppression in our society around that. But it could also be about sexual identity, for example. So there's all number of things that we get bullied about.
Mm,
Um, and some people just disregard it and say it was just part of growing up. And it's a sad fact that it is a part of growing up for some people, but that can have quite long-lasting effects on people, especially the kind of being humiliated,
mm.
and also taking on what the bullies have said, and starting to believe that there's something fundamentally wrong with you for whatever facet that they're bullying you for. So that's also kind of is more comes in the realm of being traumatized, actually.
You know, it's interesting as you're saying it, because I was reading I was reading a little article on, I think it was the 7 Ages of Man. I think it was something like that. It may sound familiar. But it's crazy to think. Well, I mean, it probably makes sense that from something happening at the start of your life affects everything. And then each time that gets affected, then something else comes along, and then it just constantly creating problems. It's really interesting, especially like school. Personally, for me, I always thought it was like, I don't know, it's a weird place. Loads of children in almost like a prison, not like a prison, obviously, but in this confined space, and the kind of crazy things that go on. Like me even trying to remember what school's like for me, the kind of things that children would say, and on one hand you might be like, oh, they don't know any better, but at the same time, something that doesn't seem that much to one child affects the else completely differently.
And there's the point. Yeah, it's the effect of it. So from the outside world, it may not seem much. There may be some small comment that's made, but that can actually have quite a devastating effect. Yeah. It's, and especially like when we're young, like when stuff happens to us when we're growing up, when we're young people, small people, and small people are of course are dependent on those around you. So like when you're an adult, you can generally like go to the toilet, feed yourself. Do you know what you know, you're a bit more independent. Whereas when you're young, you're dependent on some bigger person around you who's looking after you and looking out for you. And those years are really when we can be quite affected, really.
Before we go too far into this one, I just wanted to ask one more question.
Sure.
Do you find that like the people that you're treating, do you find that they're typically younger or older? Is that like a specific age range that you tend to find you end up?
No, all ages really. I don't treat children and adolescents because I'm just not trained to do that. It's not really my speciality. And in order to work with children and adolescents, then one has to be able to communicate kind of in the right way so that they can understand you. And it's just not my field of expertise. So that's one population I don't work with, but that's me. I don't work with them. It's not to say that other people don't work with them. But yeah, I work with all age ranges apart from children and adolescents.
Cool. I think there's actually a question further on that talks something around this kind of thing, so it'll be interesting to come back to it a little bit later. The next question we have: how long have you been doing therapy, and do you remember how many patients you've treated in your career?
So I've been a registered mental health nurse for longer than I care to mention, 25 years or so quite a long time. And I've come to therapy not that long ago, actually, or this form of therapy. So I've been offering EMDR therapy just for a couple of years now. And actually, I could probably tell you to the number how many people I've worked with, because I keep a record of that for my supervision. So sometimes people think therapy is like, oh, I'm going to go into therapy and it's going to take years and years. And sometimes people do enter into a process which is very open-ended, like a psychotherapy process, where they might be in therapy for years. And some people find that really beneficial. Other forms of therapy can be a little bit shorter. And EMDR is generally focused on a kind of specific stuff. So you kind of agree with the person, you make a contract with the person, what are we going to work on? And then we'll evaluate and we'll take so long to do it. It's difficult always to put an exact amount of sessions that something would take. But yeah, it's kind of relatively short-lived. So sometimes I work with people for as short as 6 sessions and sometimes like 24 sessions, something like that.
Okay. Which profession do you prefer, therapy or being an instructor? Clearly, you can see a couple of the people would have went onto your Instagram and kind of saw what you were doing. If you had to give up one, which one would it be?
Oh, that's a tough question.
Thought it might be.
What I really enjoy. So when I was growing up, I used to be like, oh, you get the message like, get a proper job, have a proper career, get your retirement plan in place, blah, blah, blah. And it took me a while to realize that that's basically a crock of shit. And I can choose to do that if I want to. That might be the path I choose to do. But actually, there's many other ways to live life.
Love it.
Right. And I think a lot of people from the olden days, they would say like, you work hard through life, you get to 65 and then you can enjoy life. And I'm like, do you know what? I might be dead by then. A
No,
plane could
funny.
come out of the sky and like hit me on the
Mm,
head.
that's
Um,
life. That's life.
right. So I'm a little bit like, life's here to be kind of like taken. You got
Mm,
this gift of life, so kind of grab it and run with it. And I soon figured out that that way of living was not quite for me. So trying to get to answer the question, I have various things I do. So I work part-time for the NHS. I said I'm a part-time therapist and a part-time yoga instructor. And these are different income streams and also different interests of mine, which kind of vaguely fall under the kind of blanket of people. Blanket,
yeah,
umbrella, you know what I mean.
yeah, get the
So
same
I
idea.
enjoy working with people, yeah. So to say one of them would be a favorite is tricky, because on some days I'm like really, really engaged with one thing and find the other thing harder.
Mm,
And then another day it will flip around. And I think if you expect that one thing is going to bring you happiness all the time, it's just not going to be true. Life doesn't bring you happiness all the time. There's always this kind of rocky road that you're kind of
mm.
navigating. And hopefully in that you're kind of learning new stuff and kind of growing and developing. And you can see I'm avoiding answering the question.
No, no, I completely understand. Like, I
So
understand
there,
that,
it's
like,
kind of, the
a lot of
balance is
it's,
important.
yeah, that's it. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Great answer. I do
But
think
to
it,
answer the question, I won't
yes.
shy away from it. To answer the question, probably I would fall down in. I would say that if I had no choice, I could only do one thing. I'd do therapy, because that probably brings me the most satisfaction.
Okay, and I suppose you can still obviously do yoga in your own time as well. So there you go, that's the benefit. Next question. Did you plan to become a therapist from the start? If not, what was your original plan and why didn't you? You
Ah,
guys came with some good questions. I'm enjoying these.
very good questions. It helps us make a good podcast.
Mm.
Actually, when I was at school, I wanted to be an archaeologist.
Oh, I'll be honest with you. I love the idea of archaeology. I used to hate the idea of history and all that kind of thing. But the older I've gotten and the more that you kind of look at the world and that kind of thing and realize that not everything is fact like you're being told and you kind of
Yeah,
want to find your own answers,
yeah,
I
yeah.
do think archaeology stuff is really interesting.
Well, I think I was interested in it because I thought it would be fun to like brush the dirt off the bones. like like that's archaeology, right?
Yeah.
Cleaning up old bones. What was I thinking? um yeah, so that soon dissipated that idea. I was like, let's get real. Yeah, choosing, what was the question, what did I want to do? Yeah, choosing what I wanted to do has been really difficult, I feel, for me. So for many years, I mean, I kind of trained as a nurse because it was almost practical for me to do so. At that point I started as
Mm,
an untrained member of staff, and basically I wasn't paid enough money and nobody listened to me, and I didn't like that. And so I thought I
uh,
better do my training to become registered, at least somebody might listen to me, which wasn't really the truth. Uh, but so I kind of like fell into something, and I'm really happy that I did a training in a profession, because especially in the pandemic, like at least I've had a profession which is, I've been continued to be employed. How
yeah,
lucky was that?
100%, 100%.
Um, so so I kind of fell through that, and then I've done yoga all along, and I did a dance training as well, and so I was kind of like falling through things a little bit, kind of going, well, this is
Mm,
kind of interesting. And I've got to a point in my life now where I'm like, I'm not sure I know what I'm doing.
mm,
I don't think there's, people talk about goals, and in
mm.
some degree, you have to have a plan and a goal a little bit. Like we planned
Yeah.
to do this podcast, so that's a plan, right? Um, but you have to be a little bit careful about that, because your ideas huge shift and change as you grow and develop, and then sometimes it kind of, what you want to head towards shifts as well. And I
Mm,
think you have to be quite open to that. So I kind of fallen through things, and like I said, I came to the therapy not through the mental health route but through the yoga route, which was kind
mm.
of not as you would expect it.
Yeah, yeah.
And I don't know what the next chapter holds, etc. So I've always been interested in writing, but I've never quite got over the hurdle of committing myself to it. And so
Yeah.
there could, yeah, other things could kind of crop up. I think being really open to opportunities is kind of important.
Mm. A
Yeah.
question that I kind of had while you were talking just then. So you're saying you kind of like kind of like went with the wave almost, if you know what I
A
mean.
little bit.
How do you remember how it kind of felt at that point? Because I know that like life's a very unpredictable thing. You kind of have to you kind of have to grow to understand that certain times you're just gonna have to flow with life.
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to like jobs and that kind of thing, and
Yeah.
especially in this kind of time. So I
Yeah.
mean, how did you feel at the time, and what kind of advice would you be able to give people that feel uncertain about their career path or that kind of thing?
I think, well, we have to, there needs to be some basis. There needs to be like a foundation. So like if you're like flowing through life, but you don't actually have a roof over your head or enough money to get by, you're not going to have the time to like flow through life. You're just going
Mm,
to be like, I need a job to like pay my bills and, you know, pay my food or whatever. So there does have to be like a foundation, like a practical foundation. So unfortunately in life, most of us have to work to earn
yeah.
some money. And then I think once you've got your foundation set and you feel a little bit secure, like maybe you've got like good people behind you, good family, whether that's your biological family or your logical choice family, for example, you know, once you've got that support in place, then you might be able to kind of ride the wave of life a little bit. And I think sometimes for me, it's been quite passive. Like I'm just like, well, I'm doing this and not really thinking about what I'm doing. I'm just kind of going day to day.
Mm,
And then at a certain point, you have the capacity to question. You're like, well, why am I doing this?
yeah.
Actually, what am I really interested in? Or you bump into somebody or have an opportunity that
That's
pulls
it.
you in a different direction.
Mm, mm,
Um,
mm.
and I think if you're too gripped on with a plan, you're like, this is my plan. Sometimes that works out and sometimes it doesn't. So you have to be willing to kind of like change a little bit and adapt. So in terms of how it feels, it's taken me a long time to be comfortable with just flowing through life and not quite knowing what it's going to be like. Yeah,
Yeah, no, I fully understand, man. I feel
bit of
like
a
that's
journey.
exactly where I'm at the moment. And I'm sure that there are a lot of other people that are certain days I feel like, oh, everything's fine, and the next day it's like the
Yeah.
whole world's crashing down around you.
Yeah.
But
And there's a certain, like, that's kind of life to a certain degree. Like our emotions
mm,
kind of go up and down anyway. So, and you know, if we fall into our emotional world too much, we'll make decisions we might regret later on. And if
yeah,
we can take a slightly distant step from our emotional world and say, well, okay, I'm feeling like this today. And actually,
mm,
yesterday I was feeling like that, and recognize that it's quite changeable, then we can be a little bit more objective. Um,
you
yeah,
say to nurture present, not present, sorry, nurture. What's the word I'm looking for? Patience.
a little bit of patience helps, I reckon.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I'm learning at the moment, trying to at least.
But the other
Um,
thing, I think one of the things that really motivates me is people, like I said, and actually meeting people, meeting new people, having
yes.
my like horizons expanded by other people's experiences is probably one of the things I value the most.
Man, this is a bit of a side note from this kind of thing here. I don't know whether you've seen that I've been kind of trying to run a bit of a movement called BSDL Life at the moment. When lockdown kind of eases out a bit, I would love to like have like more event type things going on. And listening to you talk just then, I would love to like have you be able to even come and talk at some of these kind of events. So I do think there's so many people, so many people that have these same kind of thoughts, and you kind of just put it out so clearly just then. That was really
Oh,
nice. Thank
thank
you.
you.
Um, Next question. What are things you would consider to be perks or benefits of the job? Mm,
Hmm. Perks or benefits of being a therapist, I guess.
I suppose maybe
Um,
like a bit of a two-part kind of thing. Because obviously you do instructoring, you do the two of
Instructoring,
them.
the yogaing.
That's it.
Um, so perks of yoga, it's quite simple. I like being with people. I like seeing people develop. You know, if like somebody's like, oh, I couldn't do that pose and now I can do it, and they feel a sense of accomplishment and kind of a sense of confidence in themselves, that's really kind of fun to be around. That's infectious, actually. It kind of rubs off on you.
Quick question on that one,
Also,
real quick. Sorry.
yeah,
Have you always found yourself to be a bit of a teacher, if you know what I mean? Like naturally doing the teaching kind of thing?
probably,
Okay.
yeah, yeah. I like seeing people kind of discover new things or discover new things about themselves, and they, you know,
Mm,
because we're just so focused on like outside, like what the outside is,
mm.
and then measuring ourselves against the outside, like, and Instagram, of
No
course, is
fault
the
of our
platform.
own. Society does this.
No, it's
This
just,
is what
yeah, how it
happens.
is, right? Yeah, you know, how many children do you have, and how big is your house, and how
There
big,
you
you know,
go.
what kind of car do you drive? It's like, um, and you know, for a lot of people that's really important, but it needs to be balanced out with like, how do you feel inside? And sometimes like doing the simplest thing, like, oh, I did a cool yoga pose that I couldn't do before, is like gives you a sense of accomplishment. And
Mm,
what use is that in life, doing a cool yoga pose? It's good for Instagram maybe, but it's not gonna, you know, there's not a lot of use to it in a sense. But the value it has actually is in feeling good in yourself.
mhm. And that
Without,
has so much more value than people realize nowadays.
yeah,
So
yeah.
much more.
So
And
some of the some of the benefits of yoga are kind of like seeing that. Other benefits include meeting people. I meet kind
mm,
of really cool people, and you know, I've become friends with some people who come to my classes. So that's been really nice. Having a sense of like community. It's weird in the yoga room because it's like, oddly, yoga can be massively competitive. Like, how high is your leg? Can you do a handstand? That kind of rubbish.
okay.
Um,
I didn't even
it
think
can,
about that.
yeah, yeah, it can be. Um, yeah, it can be. uh, because it's not meant to be competitive,
Right, exactly.
but there's like, can
But
be a little bit of an undertone.
yeah,
And whereas if you go to a competitive sport, you play competitive sport, it's like, this is a competitive sport. And sometimes the undertone is actually team, like, yeah, let's do it
yeah.
together, you know, like, anyway.
No, it's an
So
interesting little side thought.
yeah, yeah. So oh, I've completely lost my train of thought. My brain went dead. What was I talking about?
Perks and benefits
Perks of
of
yoga.
the therapy side.
Yeah. So in terms of therapy, it's kind of a similar thing in that I get to see people have like, you know, sometimes some major transformations.
Mm.
And major transformation in therapy is not necessarily that you're going to come out of therapy and be happy and content every second of your life from there on.
It would be
That
silly to
isn't
think
life.
that's the case, like it's a
Yeah.
magic thing that just
Yeah.
happens and changes.
And we can't be happy every second of our time,
You wouldn't want
because
to
stuff
be.
happens. No, no. And if you're just happy all the time, how do you know? Because you can't get anything to measure it
Exactly,
against.
exactly.
But people have some quite major shifts in how they feel about themselves, what they
Mm.
think of themselves, and also some kind of major behavioral changes as well. So, you know, I've worked with people who survived like some pretty horrific abuse
Mm.
and have, you know, been able to kind of like not get in their car at night or something because that's when the attack happened. And then, you
Uh,
know, they've kind of come back to me and they said, oh, I got in my car and went down to the shops the other night and only realized when I got to the shops that I'd done it. And this is kind of like a major shift because they'd never done that before because they were too
of
scared to.
course.
Yeah, yeah. So that's kind of really fun to be around. And also the kind of like, you can see that people start realizing like maybe something wasn't their fault, maybe that they're actually not to blame for this, that kind of stuff. And this just enables people to kind of put the past to bed, like where it should be, like in the past, and move forward with their lives.
Great answer. Great answer again, of course. Yeah, next question. Do you see yourself staying in the same position, or is there anything you want to give a try? It's kind of linking back to what you were talking about earlier on. Mm.
Yeah. So there's some other trainings that I'd like to do to add into what I've got. So part of being a professional, I don't know why I did that. Any professional will want to like continue to develop themselves and to keep up with like modern trends or recent research and all that kind of thing. So there's some trainings that I wouldn't mind doing to add into the kind of like therapeutic offering I have. And personally, I'm kind of like more interested. I'm kind of interested in a few things. One is spirituality.
Oh,
Oh, and
oh.
it's kind of it's like a big word, and
It's
I'm
yeah.
not even sure what I mean by that, but something around kind of connecting beyond the mind, the body, something
Mm.
about the kind of like energy of the planet or something. I don't really know. The energy of the planet, the universe, the cosmos. I don't know. Is there something greater than us? All that kind of stuff. So,
Mm.
um, and
Do you have any
therefore
idea
being,
how you might get into that?
well, yoga is kind of like pretty much one of those journeys anyway into
Mm.
spirituality. So it's kind of not that foreign to me in some respects. And when I
Mm.
say spirituality, I'm kind of not really into organized religion particularly. I never have been.
Yeah,
And
it's a
I have
strange place to be.
I have my own viewpoints about that. And faith can be really important for people, and organized religion can be part of faith. And if that works for people, that it's not my place to say that's the wrong thing, because it's not.
I have
But
a
it's
lot of
just not
respect
for
for that.
me. Yeah, yeah, it's just not for me. So something about spirituality or something would be interesting to me personally.
Mm.
And as I said earlier, writing, and there's something about expressing my ideas, or kind of understanding what my ideas are. What is it I want to express into the world?
Mm. Do you find that easier
Something.
when you're like writing? No, oh gosh.
If I found it easy, I'd be doing it.
No, it is a very interesting kind of medium, especially like personally myself. I've been only 22. I've grown up in the technological era, so
Yeah,
I find now actually writing my thoughts down, like writing anything down, it's a strange.
way
It's
to do it.
yeah, yeah, but there's a charm to it. There is a certain kind of charm to it. It is interesting, definitely.
Yeah, when some of us went to school, there were no computers. Can you imagine?
Oh, it is a very strange thing. Like I've been watching a lot of documentaries in terms of where we are now, and then looking back even the last 100 years, and it's yeah, humans are amazing, and how far we've come is crazy. Anyways, before we get onto that tangent,
That's a whole
um,
other, yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah. Now we're gonna go through a couple of questions that are a bit more personal to the people that would have sent them in. Obviously, they're anonymous, but we'll
So
just kind of.
one thing to say about that is, like, this podcast is like us chatting.
Mm,
And I hope that some of this information is useful, but this podcast is not a replacement for therapy and is no personal advice to anyone. So if somebody does need personal advice, then I can maybe mention at the end. I mean, first step is going to be your GP if you want personal advice about your mental health. And there are some other websites like Mind has quite a lot of information. So let's just be clear that I'm giving out some general responses to questions, not personal advice. And if you do want personal advice, then I suggest you follow that up, yeah, with your GP, or by looking up Mind, for example.
perfect. That's amazing. I'll chop that into that. That goes at the start of the video. So
Well,
before we start
here
going
is
into anything.
fine, but wherever, yeah.
Oh yeah, yeah. No, thank you for that. Yeah. First question. How to deal with anxiety and coming out of lockdown.
Um, Anxiety is a tricky one, because generally anxiety is about the future.
Yeah.
It's about getting worried about something that will happen, generally. Although anxiety is generally based on our past experiences and how we've learned to cope.
Mm.
But generally, anxiety is about kind of living in the future a little bit. Depression is a little bit about living in the past. And these are major generalizations, just as
Yeah,
a
I
way
don't
of
think I
thinking
even
about
really
it.
fully understood that until you explained it just then. Okay.
And I think of it a little bit that way, and that's like, some people it may not be that way, of course. So anxiety can often be about worrying about stuff that will happen, or that may happen, or is possibly unlikely ever to happen, actually. Because then we can get into catastrophizing. Well, if this happens, then that will happen, and then ultimately it will be this, bam, big thing. Some people have some genuine fears, which are, like I said earlier on, about the foundations, about stability, about having a place to live, having a job, and those kind of things. And those kind of things really do need addressing on a practical level. You can't expect your anxiety to kind of dissipate if you're worried about the fundamental things. So taking action to address those things is going to be massively important to give you a base to move away from. Coming out of lockdown, there may be some anxieties around health, of course.
Mm.
One of the major things that I could advise is resisting the urge to look at media and social media. So a lot of people have been like looking at that 4 or 5 times a day, checking, updating, then looking at social media for all of the kind of I was going to say unadulterated, but like, kind of unresearched, or just like general information, or sometimes even just
Yeah.
people's opinions. And we have to be really careful, because we're like sponges, we soak it up.
Yeah.
And even if
It's a strange kind of addiction, it seems.
Yeah, yeah. So I think it's really, like, in terms of health, like, and especially in this time of like COVID, I think like restricting your media input is really important, and especially before you go to bed. A lot of us like to flick through the phone. I mean, personally, I don't. I've been really good. I haven't got a habit of that. But this is kind of the worst thing you can do before bed, because basically you're stimulating yourself massively. And even if you think it's all right, your conscious mind is like, oh, I'm just doing this. It's all going
Mm,
in, all going
mm,
in.
exactly. It's made to
Um,
go in.
yeah, yeah. So health is going to be one, and then perhaps just even kind of being with other people again. So beside the health risks that people might think that they're at, it's going to be like being with other people and socializing. So it's probably best to approach those things bit by bit. We can't just jump back in to how it was. We can't anyway, because the government is trying to manage this thing. So we have to abide by those guidelines, of course. So we can't jump right back in where it was,
Mm,
and the future will be different. It's just going to be different. But I think it's probably exposing yourself to social contact with those people who are more solid and more grounded and less kind of erratic. So
mm.
sometimes we get attracted to people who are kind of exciting and kind of do crazy
Yeah.
stuff. But maybe at this point you just need to be like a little bit steady with yourself, so that you're not again overstimulating yourself. The other thing about anxiety is generally it passes.
Mm,
Generally,
mm.
even in extreme cases where there's an anxiety attack, generally there will be a start and an end. When you're in it, it's really hard to figure there's going to be an end, because it just is massively overwhelming and takes over your whole existence. But actually, if you've had it before, you'll know it's come to an end. So we can always think it's going to be over at some point.
Great answer. Great answer. And I'm glad you brought up that point of like, I know a lot of people are thinking, you know, Boris has said whatever. Now, oh yeah, place is gonna be opened up, let's get messy, all that kind of stuff. I think a lot of people have like expectation versus reality of what it's actually gonna be.
Yeah.
I do think people need to think about that a little bit. Great answer though. Next question. This one's interesting. I feel like my parents favor my sibling over me. Have you heard this kind of thing before?
Yeah. I mean, I think that can be. So I grew up as a single child, and
Okay.
then I had two half brothers, which were kind of like quite a bit younger than me. So,
So
and
you
then
were the
I had all.
oldest.
I was the oldest, yeah. So I grew up as a single child for like quite a long time. So um, there's lots of dings going on.
Sorry, yeah, my phone I
Sorry.
just put it on charge. Apologies.
Um, so I think if you're kind of feeling that there's some kind of unevenness about love or acceptance or yeah, acceptance from your guardians or your parents, it's probably best to mention it, because it could well be that actually that's a perception that you've had from some small comment that
Mm,
kind of went in like an earworm, went in and kind of went round. And it may actually be that the perception of that is not actually quite the reality, and there may be another reason why something has happened that's made you think that way. And if we don't give those people, so parents in this instance, if we don't give them a chance to kind of answer to that or speak to that, then all we
mm,
have is to make it up in our heads a little bit. And that's
yeah.
not to blame, we're not blaming anyone here. Like, I totally have had interactions where I've kind of like gone slightly like this with them, and the
Mm,
reality's been completely different. And I'm like, oh, okay, I didn't think that at all.
mm,
So I think some sense of kind of maybe addressing that, and to address it directly would be quite hard, but maybe to address it a little bit more indirectly, like, should we spend some time together? Or you're doing this with, my sibling, like, can you do this with me, for example?
mm.
I, yeah, that's kind of what
If
I
I
would
may
say
say
to
my
that, really.
part on it as well, like from like my own personal experiences recently, um, I do think people look at relationships as though they're different kind of things, but every relationship is in some way, shape, or form the same thing, if you know what I mean. Communication is the core of it. And I think
Mm, yeah.
exactly what you just said is exactly where I was with my mom previously. I
Mhm.
always thought that there was a certain kind of way that she may have felt or whatever, but until I actually took the second to be like, Mom, look, let me just talk to you like two adults just talking, that's when I
Well,
started to
and
understand it.
That's an interesting point, because I don't know how old the person is that's asking that question. So certainly for people who are going through like the shift from being child to teenager, and then you've got this weird, I don't know what teenagers, like what were we then?
Yeah,
We were like really trying to
yeah.
figure out some stuff. And then there's a shift from teenager to adult. And often in relation to our parents, the shift into adult happens kind of quite late. You can
Mm.
be kind of into your adult years for quite some years before there's a real shift to adult relationship. So there's all that at play as well. But probably opening the lines of communication, and maybe not directly, like I said, like you could just ask directly, like, do you favor my sibling? But it may be that adult doesn't even have any idea that you're feeling that way and is kind of quite
Yeah.
shocked, like, oh God, I had no idea. Or it could be that there's a specific thing that's happened and you could, that person could say, like, do you remember when that thing happened? That was kind of weird. And I kind of felt like, and here's the really important thing is, if you say, I feel like something, I feel this, I feel that, no one can argue with you.
That's it.
They can't argue with how you feel about things. They also can't argue with what you're thinking. What you're thinking is what you're thinking. Now, whether that's right or wrong is a different argument. But, if you say, here's what I feel, here's what I'm thinking, then that can't be argued with. Somebody could say, well, you're wrong, you're thinking wrong. And I'm like, well, how useful is that? Like, oh, I
Mm.
didn't know you were thinking that. That's really interesting to hear that.
No, that's a great point. That's a great point. Personally, myself, I think from I've been doing things like that, like conveying these kind of things, it does make a massive change. Again, great advice. You're absolutely smashing it. Well, you're on fire. Jeez. Oh, this one's interesting. This one came from I think a bit of an older person, but nonetheless, I'm struggling to keep my work life and personal life separate. I moved my office from my room, as in bedroom, I believe, but I still end up getting sucked into it.
So sucked into what? I wasn't quite sure what that was.
I
Sucked
think they're talking about the
into
work,
work, I guess. Yeah,
the
yeah.
work, I'm assuming, yeah.
So, I mean, it's all very well if you're lucky to have a separate office. I have a separate office, this like messy room behind me. It's like
Mm.
separate. So I'm really lucky that I can walk out of here and then the rest of the house is there. It's that kind of device, isn't it? It's like you just want to be careful what you do in your bedroom. Oh dear. So you don't want to do stuff, bedrooms for
Sorry.
sleeping. Maybe somebody does.
Yeah, let's keep this
But,
PG. Let's keep this PG, guys.
keep it PG, right? Yeah. But like if you end up doing like your work in your bedroom, or you're like kind of doing loads of stuff in your bedroom, then it becomes associated with lots of other stuff. So TV in the bedroom is one of the classic things, isn't it? So so if you have the luxury of having a separate space, it sounds like that person already does. The other thing to do is to set time limits, or to leave certain objects like kind of phones and notes, to leave it in the other space and to walk away from it. That could be another thing. The other thing to do, which we don't do very well working from home, is to set break times, or to have break times, because we just kind of hang out and then we think, oh, I'll have a little break now, I'll just do this or whatever, and you're still in the same space. You're better off stand up and go off somewhere, make your cup of tea, go and have your like sandwich or whatever for lunch, or even better, of course, go outside.
Yeah. I'm very guilty of this. I will say I am very guilty. Like I personally struggle a lot with like separating work and personal life myself as well. So I'm really feeling
The boundaries of time can help that. Sometimes you can do things like for every 40 minutes that you work, then you get up, or you have like a 10-minute break. Sometimes that can be more productive than just like slogging through. So I remember I worked in an office donkeys years ago, and actually this is slightly different, but I put my back out, and it's because I was sat down for like hours and hours. So every hour I set an alarm on my phone, and I would stand up and I would go outside the office, physically outside. I would walk up and down the street and then go back upstairs. People probably thought I was mad, but it just kind of cleared my head a bit.
Exactly.
Yeah. The other thing to do, I was just going to say, the last thing I was going to say is like the trouble with working from home is there's no buffer between home and work. So the buffer often between home and work is the commute. So whether you've got to drive or walk or cycle, or you've got to get on some public transport, there's like a moment in time. It could be like 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 40 minutes, whatever, that you've got a buffer where often people will do something else, like listen to a podcast, read their book, go to sleep, or
listen
just
to this podcast. Hey.
So there's no buffer between work and home life if you're working from home. So that's another idea, is to stick a buffer in, and the
Mm,
buffer could be something different. So it could be that in that time I'm going to like listen to this podcast, and I'm going to sit and like on the sofa and do that, and I'm going to do something quite specific. Or it could be that you decide to do your physical exercise, then you do your meditation then, or you take
mm,
yourself for a walk, so that you're doing a different behavior than you were doing and that you will do once you've finished work.
mm. Okay, I see, I see. One thing that as I said earlier, I get told off a lot by my best mate for just constantly just sitting in front of the PC, just make sure I get work done. My excuse a lot of the time is that I genuinely enjoy it.
Yeah.
But what would you say to that? Would you still say, like, even if
It
you're in gym or
depends,
you're
because
doing,
if it's not a problem, it's not a problem.
mm,
But
there
if
we
it's
go.
it,
I
do you know what I mean? So like if it's working out for you, then why change anything? There's no right way of doing anything.
That is, do you want to say that one more time, sorry?
If it works for you, so you can think of like very generally in life, you can think of things that you do, we'll call those behaviors, yeah,
Hmm.
things that you do, also things that you think, we could call those as well internal behaviors. You could think of those things, are those things bringing me towards the direction I want to go in, or are they taking me away from the direction I want to go in? So
Okay.
you could divide behaviors into that kind of like two categories, yeah. So for example, if like sitting in the computer and getting your work done in 8 hours solid and not like blinking works for you, then great.
If it's not
But
broken,
for the
don't fix
next
it.
person, it's like maybe a complete problem, in which case that
Mm,
behavior is not bringing them towards where they want to go, i.e., get work done, and it may be taking, in which case they may want to change it.
mm. But in general, would you say it's important to just make sure that you're at least keeping an eye on yourself, whether it's your inner and your outer kind of self, if that makes sense?
Yeah, is it working?
Yeah,
Is this working for me?
nice,
And if it's
nice,
not, then you might need to change something. If it works
good.
for you, then cool.
Oh, quick question. Do you tend to do like a bit of a yearly look back, or like a couple, like a monthly kind of look back, where you do that kind of thing, where you stop for a second, look at everything you've been doing, and kind of go, is this working? Is that like a regular
Yeah,
thing you do?
no, it's not a regular thing I do, but I find that kind of like certain dates promote that thinking in your mind. So
Mm,
the classic one, of course, is New Year's. New Year
of
kind of
course.
often makes a lot of us reflective. What did I do last year? Is there something I didn't achieve? Was there something I didn't want to be doing? What do I want to
Mm,
change? And then we talk about New Year's resolutions. Sometimes New Year's is a good time to kind of like reflect, like what is working here, what isn't
mm,
working. Um, Sometimes it can be birthdays. Sometimes your birthday
yeah.
will be like, or sometimes people will have specific anniversaries that make them kind of think of that. Sometimes it's kind of anniversaries of people who passed away in their lives that makes them evaluate their own lives, you know.
Yeah.
um, and some people will like to do things like, oh, I'm doing my finances or my budgeting, and that's the point when I look back and reflect a little bit. So I think reflection is important. I think prescribing it and saying you must do it, you know, once a week, once a month, or whatever, is a bit like it's another task that you'll fail at and you might beat yourself up about.
Mm,
But some reflection I think is super useful.
nice. Nice. Um, Next question. I don't feel like my therapist likes me very much. Mm,
That's
it's not
interesting, and it,
a statement, but do you?
yeah, it is a statement. Yeah. So again, this isn't personal advice, so I don't know specifically the situation there, etc. So I have two things to say to that. One, it could be that that's a function of you feeling that people don't like you.
Ah,
It could be that
yes.
in that relationship with that therapist, because that's not a normal relationship, that's a much more intimate relationship with a therapist, and also a one-way relationship. It's a very unusual relationship. So it could be in that dynamic that inner feeling, people don't like me, has come forward, and then you're kind of almost projecting that onto your therapist, or thinking that my therapist must think that also, because everybody thinks
Mm,
that, because fundamentally you believe it inside. That could be something like that going on. I don't know. It could also be that your therapist doesn't like you.
oh, yeah. This is. There's a couple more that's really talking about well, the kind of relationship between the therapist and the actual person, which is something
Yeah.
that I was surprised that
So
people even
Yeah. So the relationship with your therapist is like kind of super important. It's kind of like,
Mm,
half of the reason it will work is the relationship with the therapist. And if you think about people in the world, I don't know about you, but I don't relate to every person I meet.
yeah,
Some
yeah.
people I relate to, some people I relate to really well, and there's like a connection. And most
Mm.
people, it's like, oh, good morning, how are you? Like they're not my
Yeah.
people, but that's fine. I'm not going to be rude about it. I'm just there's going to be not a connection there, so I'm going to be like, well, it was nice to meet you, and I'm moving on.
Mm,
um,
mm.
so naturally we'll be drawn to certain people more so than other people. That's because we have personalities, and therapists have personalities too. So actually, if your therapist is not that person that you kind of relate to, then you probably won't end up working with them. And that's happened to me. Like I always say that people who come for their first session, part of the job is for me to understand something about that person. Do I think I can actually help them? Am I
Mm.
equipped to help them? Is this going to work out? Am I going to be able to help them from my perspective? I don't want to waste their time. The second part of that is like that gives that person chance to like check me out. Is
Mm.
Ashley going to be the right person for me? Do I relate to them? Do I feel comfortable with him? And if they don't, good. Move on. There's somebody else. Like make your choice. Now that's all very well if you're paying for that privately, but sometimes people are assigned therapists.
Yeah, so this is another part of it, of course. But
Yeah,
do
so
you have
that's a
any
bit different.
tips for like vetting your therapist, like trying to figure out how?
Yeah, so uh, therapists will normally be, well, not normally, will be regulated by a professional body according to the therapy they trained in. So, for example, I'm signed up to the EMDR UK Association, and so I agree to certain codes of behaviour. I'm also registered under the Nursing and Midwifery Council, and I also signed up for certain ways of conducting myself, professional standards we could call them, and also they have an obligation to ensure that I'm acting in a professional way, and I can therefore be reported to that body if somebody thinks I'm acting in an inappropriate way, and there can be an investigation. So that gives a certain safeguarding, and any professional in healthcare will be registered in that way if they're offering a professional service. So there's different kind of regulatory bodies. So if you're
Mm,
looking for a certain kind of therapy, then you might want to go to that regulatory body for that therapy and see what their regulations are if that person's registered, etc.
mm,
And your therapist should be able to provide you with that information. It's in my actually it's not in my signature, it's on my website, the bodies that I'm registered with.
mm.
um, so there's a
I think I
certain
was
regulation.
I think I was more trying to get to like in terms of like just any kind of, for example, any questions you might want to ask your therapist
So
if
yeah,
you've got a
that
new
is one of the
therapist.
so that is one of the questions.
Okay,
So
okay, I see.
you would want to ensure that your therapist is regulated.
Mm, mm, mm,
Yeah,
mm.
that's kind of the first thing.
Okay, sorry, yeah.
Yeah, it's all right. It's all right. That's the first thing. Then you might want to see if your therapist will offer you some free time. So I, for example, offer a free phone call. I'll have like a 10 to 15-minute free phone call with someone just to chat with them on the phone.
Mm,
Sometimes people email me and then we have a chat on the phone, and that can give a kind of that then you as a person looking for therapy will be like, oh, that person seems all right. They seem quite nice,
mm,
or you get a vibe. Yeah. And then that might help you make your decision. And then, as I said, I always offer like the first session, not offer, but the first session is really a kind of a check-in, and then we make a contract to work together. So if a therapist says, well, you have to have 6 sessions or something with me from the get-go, then you might be like, oh, but after 2 sessions, I might think you're not my person. So most therapists will offer kind of introductory sessions or kind of consultation sessions or assessment sessions. Um, and then you may want to, sometimes you don't know what you need, so that can be a bit tricky.
another buzz.
Um, Say again?
Sorry, that was another buzz.
I didn't hear that. Yeah, so it depends. Sometimes you don't know what it is you need, what kind of therapy you need, but the therapist should be able to say to you if their kind of therapy or their offering is going to be suitable for you. Um, and sometimes how long you're qualified is kind of an interesting question to ask. What your experience is? Do you have other experiences that you pull into your therapy situation? And yeah, and also whether they have special interests might be of interest to you as well. So some people work with couples or with LGBTQ or
Okay.
something like that. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
that's
that might be other questions to think about. Yeah.
okay. Cool. And I'm assuming that like from the governing kind of bodies that you were talking about earlier on, you can kind of find out more of this information on if they
Yeah.
specialize in certain kind of field. I see.
Yeah. Yeah.
Next question. Do therapists ever get attached to clients?
Hmm. Um,
I suppose you can only really talk for yourself, but if like,
yeah. So there is some very strict standards about forming relationships with clients.
mm,
As I said earlier on, you're in an uneven relationship.
yeah.
So if you're my therapist, you know a lot of stuff about me, how I'm feeling, what happened to me in
I
childhood, maybe.
see.
I've told you all this stuff. I've poured
Yeah.
my heart out to you. I've told you my deepest, darkest secrets, maybe that I've never told anybody else, maybe. That
Mm,
could be one of the benefits of therapy, is being able to
mm,
really be true. And I may have told you all this stuff. You haven't told me any of that. I don't know
yeah.
anything about you. I know that you're, I know you're called Cece and registered with some organization and you're this kind of a therapist, but it's not reciprocal. I haven't had all that stuff back from you. It's not an even
Mm,
relationship. Yeah. So there's an imbalance in the relationship to a certain degree. It's an unusual relationship. And
yeah, yeah.
therefore, the therapist has like a position of power actually, because they know a lot about you. So there's a lot about confidentiality, about kind of keeping that information what's the word? Confidential.
Yeah.
So because of that kind of like slight power balance, it would be unethical for the therapist then to kind of like want to date or be friends with or go out with, because they already know so much about that person. It's just not
Mm,
been an equal relationship from the get-go.
yeah, I see. I see. It makes sense, to be fair. What as you were talking just then, actually, it reminded me of do you know what your birth chart is?
Mm-mm, mm-mm,
Okay, so it goes hand in hand with like astrology and that kind of thing. But essentially, I believe it's you put down the location you were born, it's like the city you were
mhm.
born, the time you were born, all that kind of thing, and supposedly it goes through like who you are and that kind of thing. For me personally, my birth chart is crazy, like crazily accurate in my opinion, and it's almost like I've ended up growing into that kind of person because when I was younger, I read it when I was younger, and I was like, who is this person they're talking about? And so from that point, I was like so against astrology or this kind of stuff. Read it again like a year or two ago, and I've been like, what? How does this even happen? But I was talking to my best mate, and they were saying that they'd probably feel quite uncomfortable if someone else read their whole birth chart
Mm.
before meeting them, and it kind of course, not the same
Yeah,
scenario, but
yeah, yeah,
yeah, it's like either way you'd feel uneasy about it. That's
yeah, yeah.
interesting. If you ever do
So
read your birth chart, though, I'd be curious to find out how you what you think about
maybe you'll have to like send me the details of where I can get one.
it. Yeah, no, I will. I'll send you a link. I'll send you a link. But yeah, sorry, carry on.
So I think I answered the question.
Yes, yes, you did. Great job. Thank you for keeping me on track. Next question. Do you ever learn anything from your clients, and what's one, for example?
Um, Kind of all the time, really. I know a few things about some stuff, but
Do
I
you
don't
ever
know everything.
learn things about yourself from those conversations with other people?
Yeah, of course. So part of the job is being reflective on yourself. So sometimes people
Mm,
will say things to you and you have a reaction. Um, you might feel something or think something, um, and sometimes those reactions can be like a little bit like disproportionate to what you're being told, and then that tells you actually that must have like touched something in me, maybe from my past, for example. So the whole time you're always like reflecting, and that's why you have supervision as a therapist. You have supervision. So I meet monthly with my supervisor online, of course, and discuss the cases and how I'm working with them. Is there something I could do differently? Is there some way I could work more effectively? And my supervisor is uh, very experienced, has been in the EMDR business for, kind of almost since the beginning, actually. I'm very lucky. So, and sometimes you react in a certain way, and then you realize that actually that wasn't what that person needed at that point, or needed to hear,
mm,
or needed done. So then you have to reflect on that. How could I change that or do that better? How could I have seen that coming and maybe given a different response? And sometimes there's just technical aspects of the kind of therapy I do. It's reasonably technical. There are certain ways that things don't work, and I have to go away and kind of like reflect on that. Often I learn things from people about other stuff in life. People will say things and I'll be like, I have no idea what they're talking about. And I'll just make a note to myself to kind of look that stuff up so I can better understand who they are, where they come from, what their world is. And I guess one of the main things, a bit like I said earlier, the reason I would do therapy above everything else is it's just always a bit surprising to me when people have transformations, because their whole like being changes, their whole face changes. Like it's, yeah, that's kind of really really
I can imagine that. I've got goosebumps over here.
Yeah.
It must be quite like it must be a pretty powerful moment. It must be a really
Yeah, it can
moment.
be. It can be, yeah. And that's you know, I feel like that's a real pleasure to be around, because I love being around people who are kind of developing, growing, kind of coming into themselves. I always think of it a bit like the Michelin Man, you know, in Ghostbusters, the like Michelin Man. Do you remember
Oh
Ghostbusters?
yeah. The massive one going through the city.
Yeah, and he was going like, and like I think sometimes in life we feel a bit deflated, and like our sense of self is so small in there. You're like, where am I? And actually I feel like sometimes people are like the Michelin Man. They kind of are like, yes, I'm here, this is it. Yeah, so
I
that's nice
love
to be
that.
around.
That sounds really nice. Like I think I've even talked to you a little bit about how I've always been very interested in therapy and that kind of thing. It would be a lot of the same reason, I think. That, oh man, I'm just sat here trying to imagine, man. That must be wicked. That must be wicked.
And that doesn't happen only in therapy. Like we have many experiences in life where you have these kind of little life-changing moments.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah.
that's the joy. That's the joy of life.
That's wicked, man. Especially when you know that you can kind of have some input into helping somebody else
Yeah,
kind of come into their own.
yeah, yeah.
Man, I'm jealous. I am jealous. Does my therapist think about me between sessions?
Yes, I will say yes, because I do. So there's a period of reflection after the session or before the next session, or sometimes both. So generally after the session, I'll make a few notes about what I thought was happening, what I think might need to happen next. And generally before the session, I'll read through my notes and check what I think is meant to be happening, to refresh my memory as well. And then often I think of people, not that I'm thinking of people like, they just crop up into my head. Sometimes people will crop up into my head and I'll be like, I think I see what's happening there. And I'll have a little aha moment. Yeah. Or I might be reading one of my like therapy books and I'll be like, oh, totally. That's totally where we need to be thinking of like next. Yeah. And that's kind of partly, I think, what people are paying for. Because
The
therapy is
extra
not
effort.
cheap. Yeah, it's not a cheap thing, therapy. But what you're paying for is not just that kind of 50-minute session or that hour-long session with the therapist. You are paying for like all their expertise, all their training, and all the development they're doing outside of your session in order to think of you.
Yeah. I mean, I'm glad that there's therapists like you that are doing these kind of things. Like I do hear, you know, horror stories and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But as I said, I'm glad to hear that there's more people.
I heard some horror stories too, as well, about therapists checking their phone in session, or just saying "excuse me," or crying, or telling stories about themselves in session.
Wow. Well, I mean, like this is the thing, right? Because even when I hear all these kind of like horror stories, I'm like, it must be a very hard place for the therapist themselves. Like even the fact, like, I don't know how much you feel like you have to be constantly monitoring your expression, like what expressions you're putting outwardly and that kind of thing. I feel like there's a lot, and you're obviously listening to a lot of other people's kind of problems, that kind of thing. I don't know. To me, it kind of makes sense that at certain points, it kind of you just get caught, if that makes sense.
You can get caught, yeah, you can get caught, but part of your job is to reflect on that, like I've said, to take that into your supervision. And you know, listening to people, being with people is not everybody's job. Not everybody wants to do that. So maybe it's, you know, people do different jobs, you know. Some people are like engineers, or they climb mountains or something, you know, like, so we're all different people doing different things with different interests and different skill sets. So
nice. Next one, Oh, how do I tell my therapist something hard or embarrassing? That's a
That
really
was
good
an
one.
interesting, yeah, that was an interesting one. I think part of the job of a therapist should be there to hear whatever it is that you need to say.
Mm,
And part of the transformation in therapy can be from being completely vulnerable and revealing yourself and all of it, all of it, all the nasty stuff as well, all the embarrassing stuff, all the dark stuff. It's all
mm,
part of you. We all have it. And it's really hard to like expose that into the world because that makes us very vulnerable to attack, not only verbally, but sometimes physically. And we have to be careful in the real world, like for some people, they live in countries where being homosexual, for example, is a crime.
yeah, it's crazy
So
that you.
you're not going to say to those people, "Go be yourself in the world," because they might end up in
Yeah,
prison or worse. So but in your therapeutic relationship, you should be able to express yourself or whatever you need. Can you say the question again? It was something embarrassing
um,
or
hard or embarrassing. Yeah.
hard, yeah. So the first thing to say would be to ask that question to your therapist.
Mm,
Dear therapist, I have something hard or embarrassing to say. Now, even saying that, you haven't said what it is yet, even saying that will already put you in a vulnerable state. You'll already be exposing
yeah.
yourself a little bit, which could be quite a transformational moment, actually, just to kind of say, this is going to be really hard for me to say. And that could be all you need to say.
No,
It could be that
true,
leads on to you
true.
saying, yeah, yeah, yeah. So
It's
the
like these
question that's
micro
been
breakthroughs.
micro, yeah, it's like breaking it down, yeah, yeah. So that
Yeah.
the question itself that's posed to us in this podcast could well be posed to the therapist, and that could be explored just a little bit. Again, this comes down to feeling comfortable with your relationship with your therapist.
Mm,
Yeah.
of course, of course. Great answer. Great answer. Um, okay, next question. We'll do a couple more of these. Sorry, let me just check how we're doing for time. It's fine. I'll
We're
chop this
almost
up a
there, I
little bit
think.
later on. Yeah. Okay, then shall we just finish up the rest of these questions and end it there?
Sure thing.
Sounds good. Um, oh, should I tell my therapist about drug use?
Mm, depends, really. It depends
Mm,
what kind of therapy you're in. It depends why you're in therapy. It depends if you've been told to go to therapy and been told not to use drugs.
mm,
It depends if you're paying for therapy and they're using your therapist for whatever you think is the right thing. It depends if you think the drug use is affecting you, is a problem. Is the drug use problematic to me? Is this behavior a problem? Is it taking me towards where I want to go or away from where I want to go?
mm.
I'm not particularly making a judgment about drug use in general. I'm
Yeah,
not saying it's
yeah.
good or bad, but is it for you taking you where you want to go? The one thing I will say about drug use, though, is there's a lot of chemicals we put into our bodies, caffeine,
Yeah.
nicotine, alcohol, quite a big one, and then all the others, cannabis and every other drug that you can think of, I guess. And so
Mm,
all of these drugs have an effect on us, and they change how we feel. They change our physiology, they change how our bodies feel, they change how our minds are, and
mm.
consequently how we feel emotionally. And if you're already a bit confused about how you feel emotionally, then that can add an extra layer of confusion for some people.
Yeah.
Um, Also, some drugs, if you're still under the influence when you're in therapy, will actually affect the therapeutic process, depending on the kind of therapy it is.
Mm, mm,
So it could well be that telling a therapist is the right thing. It could also be that that has other consequences.
mm.
So it's
I mean,
difficult to answer that question. Yeah, I was just
yeah,
going to say it's difficult to answer that question specifically. Yeah.
yeah. Well, I mean, I've only got two of them in here about drugs. I mean, if you're okay with me going on with the next one
Yeah,
as we're on
do.
it.
Yeah, yeah.
So worded a bit weirdly, theories on whether medicating yourself, e.g., weed, mushrooms, etc., and Ashley's opinion, as far as you can give.
I think yeah, so I can give my opinion, of course. So I think there's a lot of judgment, isn't there, about like self-medicating with drugs, for example,
Mm,
but it could also be that you go to your GP and you get some medication like an antidepressant or an anti-anxiety medication, which would be medicating with it, medicating. So the
mm,
self-medicating part is using a different chemical in order to kind of deal with those feelings. Generally, And again, I'll just point out, I'm making very general statements, but generally chemicals that we put into our body are mood altering chemicals and are sometimes used to numb how we feel. Because some feelings that we have to deal with feel overwhelming or just impossible to be with. Yeah. So if you've suffered from depression for a long time, or if you've suffered with a lot of anxiety, you just want it gone. Just take it away. And sometimes using either prescribed medications or off the street stuff will just take the edge off. Now, I can't sit here and say, don't do that, it's bad for you, because actually it may be taking the edge off and enabling you to function. You can still go to work, you can still maintain your relationships. Like, who am I to say stop doing it? Because that may make you a bit unstable. But often we use medications in order to deal with emotional stuff that we can't deal with, can't be with, and it just dulls it down a little bit. So it's like a numbing thing. So what was the question about whether it's okay to do that, or?
Well, yeah, I suppose, as I said, it was worded a bit strangely, but theories on whether medicating yourself, for example, weed, mushrooms, etc., and Ashley's opinion. So I suppose, yeah, it was generally about
So I think generally the self-medicating with chemicals is about numbing your emotional state, because often emotions are quite difficult to deal with. And depending on how you've grown up, you may have been taught how to deal with emotions well, or it could be the people around you, the caregivers around you, were really over emotional or maybe even dangerous, and you were like, God, emotions are really bad. And so learn from a young age not to deal with them, you know. So it also depends a little bit on what you've been taught, what you've learned as a child. We learn a lot of shit in our lives. We learn a lot of shit. We're told a lot of shit, and most of it is a lot of shit.
This is it. This is it.
Yeah. Whether you like wear pink or blue as a child, if you're a boy or a girl, who made this up?
Yeah.
And of course, historically, this was the other way around. So all that kind of stuff that we have to kind of assimilate into us.
What?
That
Sorry.
we're kind of taught.
Are you saying the blue and the pink thing was other way around?
The other way around. Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Previously.
Wow.
So
but this is exactly your point.
Exactly my point. Yeah. So we're taught a lot of stuff. So and sometimes the way we're taught to deal with emotions or not deal with emotions can affect us in later life, and we might self-medicate, as it were. If you think self-medicating is a problem, if you think it's getting in the way of your life, if you think there's something you want to deal with, if you feel like you're really out of touch with yourself as a person, then it could be well worth tackling that, and maybe getting some help with that if you need it, or weaning yourself off. But there's, if you have been numbing yourself with stuff for a long time, then if you do start reducing, then you're going to start feeling again.
Yeah,
you'll be able to feel the good stuff, but you'll also be able to feel the bad stuff. So there may need to be like, supportive relationships in place that you can kind of feel like it's okay to do that. I don't know if that answers the question.
No, I think you gave a lot of very insightful insight on the question. And it leaves things for people to think about. I don't think it's good answering someone's question fully, but just leaving something for them to think about. Nice. What will I get from therapy?
That's a difficult question as well, because it depends why do you need to go to therapy? That's the question. What is it you're trying to change in your life? So some people get through life and never have therapy. Some people get through life and never have a filling.
No, right? To be fair, 22 years, I've never had a bloody nose. Never.
Me either. Me either. God,
there we go. We're winning. Yeah. We're winning.
We're winning on that score. So it just depends, really. And like if you like fall over and break your leg, God forbid, then you go to a hospital and have some treatment for it. Now we can think a little bit about therapy as that. Stuff's happened to me and it's just not all working very well for me. And that's why was the question, why would you go to therapy?
Well, what would I get from therapy?
Oh, what would you get? Yeah. So you might want to, it depends what your goals are. So again, if you want to go to therapy to feel happy every day, that may be unrealistic. But if you want to go to therapy because you've been traumatized, or because you're having nightmares, or because you're dealing with anxiety, or because you've been depressed and you want to understand why that might be, then what you might get from therapy is, of course, the other side of that. You may be able to deal better with your depression, with your anxiety. You may like stop having nightmares, for example. So it's often worth having a goal in mind. Some people go to therapy because they want to discover more about themselves. They don't necessarily have problems, but they just want to know themselves better. So it's a little bit like, kind of, what is it you're wanting to go to therapy for? And then that might inform what you might get out of it.
I think you touched on something that's quite important as well, which might seem obvious, but that you don't have to have per se something wrong with you to go and
To
receive
benefit.
therapy.
Yeah.
100%. What should I never tell my therapist?
I couldn't really come up with anything.
Mm.
Should I never tell my therapist?
I mean, I suppose the general idea is but if you don't tell your therapist something, then no work can be done. So I suppose
A
there
little
isn't.
bit. One of the hardest things we have to do in life is to find people who we can be our complete selves with, who we can be our authentic selves with, who we can really reveal the inside. And those people are our people, and they don't run for the hills.
Oh my gosh, I'm gonna have to sound like that or something. I know you touched on it a little bit earlier on as well. I can't remember what the exact words that it was that you were saying, but no, 100%. I
So
think it
the
was
other
about
thing,
chosen. Was it? I don't think the word was chosen family. You said, but like
no, yeah. So these are not my, those were my words, but these words I'm about to say are not my words. These are Armistead Maupin, who is an author. He talks about biological family, the family that you're genetically related to,
you're right. That's
biological family,
what was his name? Sorry,
versus
Armistead.
Armistead Maupin. He's an author. So he
Yeah.
talks about biological family versus logical family, those people that you are logically going to relate to. So logical family will be your tribe, the people who like are your people.
Mm, mm. No, I do love that. I do love that. And I think it's something that I've only really started to realize was even a thing before
Yeah,
this point.
yeah.
Yeah, man. It's very important. It is very important. I do think that certain times people, they say like blood's thicker than water, but that's not always the case. You connect with who you
And
connect with.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think that's okay. You kind of make up your other family kind of around you. But to
Mm,
answer the question about what not to tell the therapist, I don't really know, because I kind of feel like you might be going to therapy. One of the things might be is to reveal more about yourself so that you can know more about yourself, be more vulnerable, for example. So that would imply that you would open up to your therapist. One thing to say in answer to that question about what you would not tell your therapist is the therapists are bound by confidentiality rules. So confidentiality means is what you tell me in therapy remains between you and me. Yeah.
yeah.
Except
This is it here.
if you come into therapy and say, well, I'm planning to blow up the Houses of Parliament next Tuesday and I've got the dynamite in my bag, clearly
Yeah.
I have an obligation to better serve the public in general and say, oh, this person. Yeah, so I would have to act on that information report. Yeah, so if
Mm.
there's some things that your therapist will be obliged to take action on, which would generally regard safety of yourself or others.
Okay. Yeah. Makes sense. Makes sense. Um, Last couple now.
Well,
What personal experience have you got? It was left quite open-ended. I'm assuming it's kind of about like your personal therapy
so
experience.
personal experience that I have I guess we touched on it earlier. I'm a registered
Yeah.
mental health nurse. I've had 25 years worth of experience with that. I've been teaching yoga for about 20 years and teach for a local yoga school, the Bristol School of Yoga. So I train yoga teachers. I'm also a trauma therapist.
Did
And I
you
have
get
quite
therapy?
extent. Yeah, so then to move on to that question, I've had various forms of therapy
Okay.
in my life. Yeah. And
Mm-hmm.
that's partly why I was interested in therapy, because I've been through it myself.
Okay.
Yeah.
Would you
And
say it's a
one of
bit
the,
of like a giving back type thing or no?
no, me giving back?
Yeah.
No, not really. I don't think so. No.
Mm-mm-mm.
Um, I think it's not giving back. It's like I've had something which was transformational, and I'm like, that's kind of cool. I'd like to share that with other people.
I see. I see. Yeah. Yeah. Nice. Nice. Um. Last question, and probably my favorite. I don't know how you feel about this one as well. I thought you quite enjoyed it last time. There are so many therapists in the world. Why do you keep doing it?
Okay. I think I read that one and kind of didn't quite get it. I'm just reading it again. There are so many therapists. Why do you keep doing it? Now, I misinterpreted that question because I thought that that
Okay.
was meant. There's a lot of therapists. Why do we need any more?
I think that's what I called it as.
Ah, okay, okay.
Uh,
Um, that's I kind of was a little bit like, well, there's a lot of yoga teachers. Do we need any more yoga teachers? um,
I suppose they're probably
that's
more asking about like your personal, what keeps
okay,
you
okay.
doing it? What keeps you doing it?
Ah, I think I've kind of answered that already just by saying that
Yeah.
I like to be around people who are kind of experienced transformation. Um, I used to many years ago go on like workshops and retreats and stuff, and I remember doing one for like young people, and I just had a little chill thinking about it. And I was like 16 or something at the time, and we talked earlier about bullying, and a lot of people have experienced that. And it was really interesting being on like a weekend workshop with young people who were like, I don't know, like kind of 11 to 18, I think.
Okay.
Um, and it was a really like safe environment, and everybody was really very supportive, and it was like quite transformational to be with young people who were supportive at that time. And I guess that was one of the first experiences of being kind of like fully accepted, or just like be who you want to be,
Mm,
and being in an environment where you were with like logical family idea, where people are just
yeah.
like right here for you. Um, so that was one of the most transformational, a really transformational experience for me. And I think what keeps me doing it is being able to be around people when they're kind of discovering stuff, and kind of, because we're on this planet, and there's some really difficult stuff to deal with, but at the same time there's like so much out there to
Mm,
experience, so much connection to experience. And I think if we can be a little bit, find that connection for ourselves, then each little connection adds up. um, and then the world's a better place.
what a way to finish the podcast. That's amazing. Um, yeah, I've been really glad to have you back on the podcast, and I don't know how everybody else home feels, but I feel like a lot of people have gained value from that. Thanks again for having me on the podcast, and I'm look forward to
You
having
are
you on
most
again in
welcome.
the future. Yeah. Hopefully as well, if while we're here, while we've still got Ashley, if you're still watching now, I would like you guys all to make sure you click the subscribe button, and make sure you're liking as well. That way we know that you guys enjoyed this content, and then we can have our Ashley back on the channel. Anything you wanted to say or plug before you leave?
No, I'm good, Cece. It's really good that you invited me back, and it's always a pleasure to talk with you.
Wicked, amazing.